Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I just want to thank you again for being patient with us. I hope you're enjoying your lunch. And this afternoon, we're going to be having a wonderful presentation. Um, and it's been our tradition to have a luncheon, which is the traditional academic spy presenting research or policy or practice um, during lunch. And this afternoon, we have a wonderful person who is here in Westchester area doing an amazing work. And she is the director of Westchester Center for Racial Equity at YWCA, White Plains, and Central Westchester. And her name is Maria Smith Dautruche, right?
Dautruche, yeah.
Dautruche. So it's my pleasure, a great honor to welcome you, Maria, for your distinguished speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Basil, and thank you to everyone here at Manhattanville. I appreciate the invitation, and I also appreciate that you should enjoy your lunch while listening to me so that your body registers at least one good experience. It's either going to be the food or the talk. If you're lucky, it's both. So I was sharing with Basil that I was slightly intimidated. I was like, International Center for Religious, Ethno-Religious Mediation. This sounds like slightly out of my wheelhouse. However, I found commonality in peace. And so we can pretend that this portion of my speech is your complimentary luncheon education. And if you know your entertainment, and if you know the song, feel free to join it. But I just want to offer a quick verse. I am not a songstress or vocalist, but this is a song I've grown up singing. And so just offering it to those in the room, if you know it, hum along, be safe in your eating, or just enjoy hearing it. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me. Let there be peace on earth, the peace that was meant to be. With God as our creator, kindred all are we. Let us walk with each other in perfect harmony. Let peace begin with me. Let this be the moment now. With every step I take, let this be my solemn vow, to take each moment and live each moment in peace eternally. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me. Thanks for the accompanying humming and singing along. So at the YWCA, White Plains in Central Westchester, where the Westchester Center for Racial Equity is a program and project, we have a commitment to racial justice, and for more than 90 years, we have been on a mission. This is our mission statement, not only at the YWCA here in White Plains and throughout Central Westchester, but at the YWCA in the 200 associations across this country, to eliminate racism, empower women, strengthen communities and stand up for social change. That is not correct. It is to promote liberty, justice, peace, and dignity for all. But we do, in doing that, strengthen communities and stand up for social change. The Center for Racial Equity, where I am the director, is a dedicated space for working towards advancing racial equity in this county by providing a vision, a place, and the community to sustain anti-racist work. This is how we envision doing our work. We think of the work as 5 pillars. We want to be a hub, being a place virtually or digitally. The center was launched last year in the pandemic. Most of our programming is virtual. So just being a place where people can come on our website and find information, and also being a place where another way of thinking about space, but also being connected to people in thought leadership and coalition throughout the community as well. We do hope to have on-site presence at the YWCA on North Street in White Plains as soon as possible. We also offer trainings, our signature Racial Equity 101 to 103 training. We also work with organizational development and offer anti-racism training and consultations. We have signature events, including our National Day of Racial Healing in January, Stand Against Racism, which is a YWCA USA-wide signature event that normally happens in March or April. We have a speaker series. We have one coming up. It's our Diversity Week virtual speaker series, which will start October 3rd in the evening at 7 p.m. It's all online. I'm happy to share information later. And we also, in partnership with the United Way of Westchester Putnam Counties, put together 21-day racial equity challenges. That's a set of emails you can receive, and every day for 21 days there's a challenge or information about race and racial equity that you can self-pace and learn on your own or with others. We do leadership development, and we also do accountability and assessment. We're in the midst of working on the narrative report that will accompany our racial equity scorecard. This is our first time trying to say, what is the baseline data that we have in this county about our appetite and our, where are we with our appetite for racial equity and policy solutions? And you can see during a time of a pandemic when any innovation that will help people feel relief or recover is welcomed. We want to just take a moment to look at the good work that's been done and just ask the question, in what ways have these policy innovations in the midst of a pandemic helped to advance racial equity? So as I talk about racial equity, what am I even talking about? I really like it when there's a presentation and we're all clear what we mean, what we're talking about. So racial equity is the condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted in a statistical sense how you fare. When we use the term, we're thinking about racial equity as just one part of racial justice. And thus we also include work to address root causes of inequities, not just their manifestation, right? So what is the root cause of housing inequity? Yes, we should definitely build more affordable housing. We should definitely work to make sure that our land use policies and ordinances are ones that advance equity. Those are still manifestations of a deeper root cause that led to the policies that segregate and exclude people, right? This includes eliminations of policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages that reinforce differential outcomes by race or that fail to eliminate them. This definition comes to us from CAPD, the Center for the Assessment of Policy Development. So when we talk about racial equity just being one part of racial justice, how many of you have ever heard the phrase, oh, we're going to use a racial equity lens to look at that situation. We're going to use the racial justice lens to, fix that problem. That's fine. I think it's an important way to look at things, to investigate things. When it gets to doing the thing, please don't be like me when I wake up in the morning and I'm like, where are my glasses? I can't see, I can't think. Don't talk to me till I find my glasses. Please, if you're going to put your racial equity and racial justice lenses on, keep them on to do the work after you've taken a look at the issue. So there's a guide, and the original guide describes 4 important features of having a racial equity lens. You're analyzing data and information about race and ethnicity. You understand disparities and the reasons they exist. You look at structural root causes of problems. Of course, that goes back to the definition we just looked at. And you name race explicitly when talking about problems and solutions, right? So if you're ever in a room, you have my permission, you are empowered, you are deputized, whatever title you need. If you're in a room and on the agenda it says we're going to talk about racial equity, and all of a sudden you realize we're not even naming race, we're just talking about people who have money and don't. Put race back at the center of the conversation, right? Because that is a slippery slope to get into not explicitly naming race and therefore having racially equitable solutions that use an idea of targeting the improvement or empowerment of one group. Now you're like using coded language. Oh, urban dwellers. Well, I was living in Brooklyn before I moved back to Westchester, and urban dwellers there were a racial, it was diverse. So who are you talking about, right? So just naming race explicitly. So then when you move into racial justice, there are 4 more critical elements. These aren't all of them, but these are like the critical that take you from I'm naming it, I'm analyzing it, I'm looking at it, I understand it. This gets you into like you're creating, you're focusing, right? So you understand and acknowledge racial history. You create a shared affirmative vision of a fair and inclusive society. You focus explicitly on building civic, cultural, and political power by those most impacted. And you emphasize transformative solutions that impact multiple systems, right? So one of the great things that happened this summer is our Board of Legislators in Westchester County made the Beeline buses, that's our bus system in this county, for those of you who are unfamiliar, they were free. You could ride the buses for free all summer. I went so many places that I didn't have to go to just because for years I had paid, and now I had 3 months where I didn't have to. I owned my car. I just left it in the garage. I didn't care. I was like, I'm taking the 25 bus to Cross County and you can't stop me. And I was so excited. And so let's say you're offering that just as an economic relief to people who've come through a very difficult time in this pandemic. Perhaps an unintended outcome is there were a number of workforce readiness programs that also launched this summer. Now, I don't know if the people creating these programs and running them were talking to the Board of Legislators, but almost everyone I have spoken to who was running such a program mentioned more people could make it to where we had the program. People were getting on the bus. We, for the first time, thought about offering childcare subsidies for those who would have to leave their children somewhere to come to the program, and they knew they would get on the bus for free. So sometimes we're thinking, oh, this is just about economic relief. But when we take a systems approach and say how many systems are touched by this one outcome we want, people not being able to get on the bus, ridership is low, we want to get ridership up. Well, now the bus is free and people are taking the bus to work. They're going back to the office. They're taking the bus to be in community with people they haven't seen, to go shopping, to go get workforce readiness programs. So when you're able to say, what are the systems impacted, you're getting closer to that justice, not just looking at one singular, but the interconnected network of systems. And we'll get into, I love talking systems, so let me just keep going because there's a reason why I keep coming to it. A lot of times people come to the Center for Racial Equity and they're looking for racial bias training, like how to undo the bias they have. And I always include this slide when talking to them. If people are familiar with Humans of New York, this is a Humans of New York post from years ago, from like 2013 or something. And it's 2 gentlemen sitting on a park bench and a question must have been asked to them, what do you do? And so they respond, we're eye doctors. And so they're asked, what's something about the eye that most people don't realize? And their answer, the eye doesn't see, your brain sees. The eye just transmits. So what we see isn't only determined by what comes through the eyes. What we see is affected by our memories, our feelings, and by what we've seen before. So there are all these ideas happening in your brain, and your brain is hardwired to look for things that are incentives and rewards, or to look for things that are threats. So if you've spent your whole life hearing stories about dark, sinister, tall characters who are scary. And then you're walking down the street and you see a dark person walking towards you. Something's going to trigger, I should be afraid. Now, you didn't see anything through your eyes that led you to believe this is someone who will do harm to me, but the story's on play in your brain, right? So it's really about when people come for this unconscious bias training, racial bias training, I try to remind them about storytelling. Tell me the stories that you have about who you are and about people who are not like you. And what meaning are you making of that? Has anyone ever called you to task as a young person about an assumption you made, right? Or if you ever saw anyone in a wheelchair when you were little and you had questions, and out of being polite, right? Because some of the unhelpful habits we have don't necessarily come from malicious places. But I remember being a little girl and seeing someone in a wheelchair and going, "Mommy, why is he in the chair?" And my mom, out of being polite, "Shh, don't point, don't look, let's go." And somewhere in my little brain comes, it's not good to ask questions about people who aren't like me. It's impolite. And I shouldn't point out differences I see. And what kind of world am I building for myself? What kind of world do I live in when I'm told it's impolite to ask questions about anything that's not like me? How do I navigate meeting new people in school and meeting new people at the job? How do I navigate being invited to a different house of worship by someone I've met? So we don't do these things to be mean to our children, to harm them, but just for a moment, reflect for yourself. What are some of the well-intended instructions or guidelines that have been given to you throughout your life that may have prevented you from being a little more compassionately curious about your own practices or the practices and behaviors of those who are unlike you? So to policies and practices, and this was developed by the Government Alliance for Race and Equity, which is now housed at Race Forward, which is another organization I do a lot of work with. They've been around for 42 years, working on catalyzing racial justice. And the Government Alliance on Race and Equity has developed one of many racial equity tools. And they offer this as a simple set of questions. And I love giving this to like community-based groups or smaller organizations, because sometimes you get overwhelmed. We're going to do a racial equity analysis. We're going to do an impact audit. And I'm like, ask yourself some questions, right? Sometimes we're really quick to jump into the orange, right into plan, and we've skipped 3 steps, right? So the first step is to have a collective vision. What is our vision for the future? And how will we measure our progress to get there? So if your vision does not include, well, we want to make sure that people who have historically not had a voice at this table now have a voice. And not only that they have the voice, but how do we at this table who've been here for years learn to listen to that voice, right? I think a lot of us have seen in recent years a lot of energy and effort to get more people of color in positions of power and leadership in organizations. And you know something that someone told me back when Barack Obama was first elected to office, celebratory moment for many people in my life. And someone just brought up, I remember it was like 2007 or 8, someone just said, yeah, it's great, it's great, right? Like, wow, this is amazing. And the United States does not have a precedent for following a Black man in leadership. They just do not know what to do. And so they're going to default to the fears and the hatred, and the vitriol will come out, and we need to be ready for that. And I think what happens often is you put a person of color into a position of power or leadership, you invite them to your board, you hire them in a C-suite space, and they come with an idea that could be more inclusive, more equitable. And it's not that the idea is wrong, it's literally that, go back to the stories you have in your mind. When in your life, before that point, when 30 years ago, did someone tell you, Black people are amazing leaders? You know, I had this amazing Southeast Asian manager, and I'm seeking that out in my next position, because that was the best. We don't say that a lot, or you don't hear it a lot, or maybe I'm just telling on myself. But, so having the vision together collectively is very important. Then you want to look at the data. What are the data? And what did the data tell you? And doing this collectively is very important because making meaning of the data you see is an important deliberative process. And a lot of us are actually conditioned to avoid deliberation because it's disruptive, right? Well, if 4 people agree and 3 of us don't, that's the majority. 3 out of 7 is a lot of people that don't agree. I feel like we should keep working till we get somewhere where people feel more engaged in the process, correct? So making meaning of the data and then looking at partnership. How can we continually partner with the communities most impacted? And partnering is a very important thing to define and describe. Sometimes people show up into communities that they are not a part of, and their partnership looks like US airdrops, right? They're just flying by, dropping some program down, dropping some money down, dropping some supplies. We've been a great partner to these people we've never seen. We're so great. Let's fly back home. Maybe that works in certain scenarios, but in a community where there have been poor police-community relations and now we want to repair them, it can't just be dropping off a bunch of flyers at the local library and hoping someone picks them up, or going into the school one time and telling kindergartners, police officers are helpers. It's going to take more of a deeper partnership where there's that pull and give and take, maybe some deliberation, maybe some discomfort, but it is all a part of making community. Then we get to the plan. And when you're making your plan, really ask, these are my favorite planning questions. Who benefits or will be burdened by this proposal? That's my favorite question at work because often I'm the one burdened, so I just love to bring that up. Like, who's doing that? That's a great idea that we're going to do 15 more programs this year. Who is doing that work? Okay, so I just love to raise that. What are our strategies to advance racial equity or at least mitigate harm, right? At least mitigate unintended consequences. So I don't live in a world where because we achieve racial equity and because we're working toward racial justice, no one gets hurt. That's not real. Because we're all trying to advance racial justice, we all have the same monolithic view and we all always agree and no one's ever upset or disappointed. That's not true, right? So we have to have practices in place intentionally to mitigate unintended consequences, such as someone feeling excluded, such as, oh my gosh, I didn't even consider that we needed to think of more than 2 languages to translate into. How do we repair that? What is our process for course correction in real time so we don't get stuck in the I made a mistake-itis, which kind of gets you paralyzed for a little bit, right? Then in the implementation, what is your implementation plan? How do you incorporate these racial equity strategies? And strengthening, how will we hold ourselves accountable, communicate results, and keep improving? It's really important to think who you're accountable to and what that accountability looks like, right? That's an important strengthening component. The more folks you're accountable to and the more ways you can define what that looks like, you're starting to get a real map of your community and your ecosystem and a really important nod, like little points you can make for where are the places where we can leverage some mobilization, where are the places where we know it's going to be some tension, who are the dissenting voices that we need to just continue to bring along, maybe listen to in a different way. So this racial equity tool is super awesome. I think it's just something you can Google, but if not, I will make sure that Basel has this and can send it to all of you who have registered today for this conference. I see a lot of people taking pictures, so I want to make sure you have it. So why does this even exist? Oh, okay, glad you asked. Because race exists. And we made it up, right? Ethno-religious is real to me. When I think of my ethnicity, that's like, it comes from this common culture and language and group of people who have some affinity with one another. It feels tribal and historic, and it also feels like something that's very close to my actual identity when I think of my ethnicity. When I think of my race, I know this is a socially constructed thing that has consequences, but it's for the most part made up. Race was used very infrequently before the 1500s and was used to identify groups of people with a kinship or a group connection. The modern day use of the term race is a human invention and a social construct that is used to separate human beings based on their skin color and other physical features. A teacher of mine, Dr. Gail Christopher, who I'll reference later on, she talks a lot about the false hierarchy of human value. This stuff is just not real. It's not true. We've made it up, but it has consequences for how we live our lives. Though race has no genetic or scientific basis, it's not biological. Racial groups are determined by the U.S. Census Bureau each year. And for those of you who are so inclined and interested, looking at United States history through the lens of the Census Bureau and through the lens of the census is a fascinating way to learn who gets to be a U.S. citizen or who gets to count here and at what rate do they count. It's a very fascinating way to think of how indigenous people have been included and at what point in our history. I'm a big fan. I partnered in my former life with the Census Bureau for over 15 years, and so there's a lot there. And it's also a problematic way to think about how we count and identify and categorize people. This comes up a lot for Hispanic and Latinx folks. It's just very limiting and restricting. You feel like you have to put yourself in a box, but that is how we do it. That's how we make choices about our power here in this country, how you're represented, the algorithms and formulas for how funding flows into your local communities, school board district seats. So if you feel like you can just opt out because you don't like the box you have to check, I implore you, do not. It comes every 10 years. Do not be surprised. Every 5th year is an American Community Survey, which gives us more data. But in 2030, we'll have a whole new decennial census, and I hope y'all don't forget that you were here hearing it's coming. So racism is a system of advantage based on race. It's also a system of oppression based on race. It's a white supremacy system. It involves one group having the power to carry out systematic discrimination through the institutional policies and practices of the society and by shaping the cultural beliefs and values that support those racist policies and practices. So take, for example, a policy that folks really is easy, it's very clear, redlining in our housing history, right? The history of redlining in this country is a racist housing policy. It is about keeping certain people, specifically at the time it came out, it was really what makes it possible today for white Americans to be the most segregated group of people in this country. We often talk about it the other way, who's excluded, but like the existence most white Americans have in this country doesn't look like this room of people from various backgrounds. It's very homogenous. And that's because of exclusionary zoning laws, ordinances, practices, a practice in real estate of I'm not gonna show this family from this community this house, I'm only gonna show that house to certain people, I'm not gonna take them to that neighborhood, it's not worth it. And also the practice of resistance when a set community is desegregated. So we think about riots and burning of homes in Chicago and other places where a black community or in the West Coast and Southwest when like a Latino family would move in and the families already existing there would just like turn to rebellion. So the stories are not that, oh, well, we just hate these people. That's not the stories you hear. The stories you hear is I'm protecting the value of my home, right? So the cultural story is that somehow non-white people are less valuable, again, this false hierarchy of human value. And because they are less valuable, if they inhabit space with me, by virtue of this mathematics I'm using, this economics that I'm using that I've also made up, all of our values will deplete and all the work I've put into the equity of my home this harms me, right? But these practices we know, and this is actually a case that I remember our Westchester County Human Rights Director, Tejas Sinchala, sharing with me, is when he was in practice, someone was selling their home, and the seller they had lined up, a white person was selling their home, and the seller they had lined up was African American. And the people in the community didn't want that sale to go through. And so the seller, the white homeowner who was selling his home, filed a housing discrimination claim. claiming that the racist policies were making it impossible for him to sell his home. And so sometimes we think about how people, we think of only one side, but one of the big pillars we keep coming back to at the center is that racial inequality hurts everyone. And so we need to keep that in mind, that the equity we seek is not just to see one group thrive, it's to see all of us thrive together, because we are all harmed by racism. So I like to think about race and racism in terms of one of my favorite authors, thinkers, people, humans, Toni Morrison, who is a great author. To me anyway. You can read her stuff and give your own opinion, but since I've got the mic, she's the best today. And so Toni Morrison says a lot of things about race. I've just picked up 3 to share today. There is no such thing as race, none. There is just a human race. Scientifically, anthropologically, racism is a construct, and a social construct. It has benefits. The very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. None of that is necessary. Racism will disappear when it's no longer profitable and no longer psychologically useful. When that happens, it'll be gone. But at the moment, people make a lot of money off of it, pro and con. And this is the quote about racism from my great teacher, Dr. Gail Christopher. Racism robs us of our humanity. And so when Toni Morrison talks about racism preventing us from doing our work, I offer the idea that our work is to be the best possible humans we can be for ourselves and each other. And racism is just one of the many things that makes that difficult, right? It shows up as a division. It shows up as again, this false hierarchy of human value. And it robs us of the opportunity to connect at a human level and to enjoy the full benefits of our humanity. So what does Dr. Christopher, who says racism robs us of our humanity, propose? She proposes racial healing. Specifically, she has a specific methodology that I've been trained in and that I'm proud to share through the Center for Racial Equity. We have trained 20 leaders throughout Westchester County in RX racial healing methodology. That is a methodology that can be used to keep circles and to facilitate around the methodology that works to bring people together in communities to tell stories that will repair us from the harms and trauma that racism caused. So just did that training a few weeks ago. Looking forward to reconvening with the group and getting feedback on how we can continue to offer those trainings to others in the coming years. But was very grateful to be able to offer that training on racial healing facilitation and circle keeping with support through the center, specifically from a few of our sponsors and supporters, including Westchester County government. So racial healing is a process that restores individuals and communities to wholeness. It repairs the damage caused by racism and transforms societal structures into ones that affirm the inherent value of all people. It makes it possible to acknowledge and speak the truth about past wrongs created by individual and systemic racism, and to address present-day consequences for people, communities, and institutions. That's a lot of words. I just want to say racial healing as a process and a tool is a trust-building, community-building, culture-building process for addressing the harms of racism, but really about building an affirming space for people to reconnect with their humanity. It is not anti-racism training. It's not a DEI workshop. It really digs into the power of storytelling for human connection. And it also digs into making sure people feel affirmed in who they are. It's a non-judgmental space. There are many ways to create these racial healing circles. Some can be affinity group based, so only people who identify as white people are talking together, or it could be mixed groups of folks, all of us together, coming together. It is up to the circle keepers and the ones that are convening the circle to decide what is needed, what is the purpose of that circle. I do a lot of circle keeping specifically with Black women and intergenerational groups, and I also work with co-facilitators in mixed race group circles, and they're very powerful. And they are based out of a larger framework. Oh, there's a long definition I just read. But they're based out of a larger framework from the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation framework. Now, this work, and I know that we're international, so I just want to be very clear, obviously built on and borrowing from and learning from many various truth and reconciliation committees that have happened internationally, chief among them South Africa, post-apartheid, and other places as well where tribunals happen, etc. Here in the United States, the work on truth, racial healing, and transformation leverages this overriding intention for truth and reconciliation models, but the U.S. adaptation emphasizes transformation rather than reconciliation. The original reconciliation model for bringing a country back together through reconciliation doesn't quite work here in the United States, where racism and the belief in a hierarchy of human value are actually integral to our nation's foundational processes. And until we deal with those foundational processes, reconciliation is just not going to work. So we work on transformation until there comes a time when the reconciliation feels more feasible and plausible an endeavor to go into. And this framework was developed with over 400 partners across the country, convened by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation over the time frame of about 8 years. We culminated in 2015 and have been doing the work of TRHT circles and RX racial healing circles since that time, in universities and in 14 communities throughout the country. And best believe I tried. I fought hard for Westchester to be one of the counties, but we're not. But now through the Center for Racial Equity, we are able to bring the work here, and so I'm very proud of that. I also want to share before I close some of the principles of these racial healing circles in case you have more questions about them. This is really the core and central love of the work I do, is that I get to introduce racial healing circles here in Westchester County. So I'm just going to share very briefly the seven key elements, I guess is the word, of these circles. And so, sorry, I just lost my place here. So the 7 RX racial healing principles, and these are specifically the principles that have been developed in the methodology that Dr. Gail Christopher offered. 1, the global human family is interconnected. And as we are all the descendants of a shared human ancestry, right? So it's coming to that commonality of our humanity. The antiquated destructive mythical belief in a hierarchy and taxonomy of human value is an obstacle to the continued evolution of humanity. This belief is to be replaced with an understanding of the truth about our interconnected and equal human essence. Our primary innate, number 3, our primary innate human imperative is to be connected, loved, and nurtured. People need to feel safe and to perceive that we are valued and not threatened by our fellow human beings. 4, a societal belief is an idea or thought that is pervasive and repeated often enough to harden into automatic behaviors, which then create structures and systems to embody that foundational belief. Right? So if you could imagine something like that, what's a foundation? A foundational belief is that entry-level, undereducated, unskilled workers are lazy people, right? That's nobody says it, but it's under there. And that's the group that hasn't been able to work from home. That's the group everybody needs to come in. That's the group where you hire an entire management class of people to supervise. Or if you are more on the radical side of language, to surveil them, to see when they clock in, when they clock out, who they're talking to, how many lunch breaks. Railroad employees were about to go on strike because they couldn't use the bathroom. So these foundational beliefs, they're not just things 1 or 2 people at the top think. They get embedded into our structures and our systems. 5, racial human hierarchy is a persistent societal belief that has caused immeasurable harm and human suffering. The belief itself must be eliminated. 6, our human brains have evolved to best retain, communicate, and understand stories and narratives. We can influence and shape core beliefs and perceptions when we engage in sharing our diverse stories of agency and resilience. And lastly, the 7th principle, we choose to co-create and to model the desired state in which all are valued equally when we experience co-facilitated, compassionate RX racial healing circles. And so for those who, that's the most exciting principle to me, is that just by keeping the circle practice, I can practice living in the racially just world I envision and want to create. And I'm also influenced by those who come to Circle who might have different ideas about that racially just world that we'd like to co-create. And so it's in time, 2 hours about whenever we get together in groups of 10 or 12 in the Circle space to really practice that listening to one another, that care for one another, to be influenced by someone else's story, and also the important agency of sharing your own story. And so that idea that it's a time where we get to practice the world we want to live in rather than exist in the one we have and point out problems, or be in the one we have and working tirelessly to solve problems. It's a wonderful boost to my health to be in Circle with people. And so I invite you to take down the contact information. And if you're interested in having a circle at your school or campus or with your community group, we're happy to come and co-facilitate these circles with you. They are very transformative. They should not be one-off things. We're also happy to come and train folks on your staff or in your community groups to be able to co-facilitate your own circles with the people that you're in community with. And I will stop there. To just say thank you again for the invitation. And the bottom line, if you've heard nothing else, is that racial healing is a tool we can use to come together in appreciation of our common humanity and to build a racially just world that we deserve. Thank you.